two important, although not major, characters within Philip K. Dick's novel The Man in the High Castle are a young Japanese couple, the Kasouras, Betty and Paul, and we're introduced to them in the very first chapter of the work, and all of the interactions that we see with them in the work are through Robert Childan. They enter his shop where they're interested in checking out his American artifacts, and they'll eventually invite him to dinner, and then Paul will have a very interesting and revealing conversation with Robert Childan about the jewelry that he's selling from the Ed Frank Jewelry Company, which represents something new. And as opposed to quite a few of the other characters like Tagomi or Frank and Juliana Frank, and of course Robert Childan, we don't get their inner thoughts. That's not something that Dick provides us with. And so we're seeing them in significant part through the eyes of Robert Childan and in terms of what it is that they say that reveals their points of view. So let's take a look at the very first interactions in Chapter 1. So we find that after his interaction with Tagomi, then Childan says he became aware a couple had entered the store. Young man and a girl, both handsome, well-dressed, ideal. He calmed himself and moved professionally, easily in their direction, smiling. They were bending to scrutinize a counter display, had picked up a lovely ashtray. Married, he guessed. Live out in City of the Winding Mist, the new exclusive apartments on Skyline overlooking Belmont. And he greets them, and the young man says, "Really excellent pieces, sir." And Childan bows spontaneously. Now here's a really interesting description. Their eyes, warm not only with human bond, but the shared enjoyment of the art objects he sold, their mutual tastes and satisfactions, remained fixed upon them. They were thanking him for having things like this for them to see, pick up and examine, handle perhaps without even buying. Yes, they thought, they know what sort of store they are in. This is not tourist trash. And then he thinks, oh, I could fall in love with this girl. And they have some discussion. He says, are your earrings purchased here? And she says, no, at home. And Childan says to himself, no contemporary American art, only the past could be represented here. And then he asks them, are you here for long in our San Francisco? And the man says, I'm stationed here indefinitely with Standard of Living for Unfortunate Areas Planning Commission of Inquiry. Pride showed on his face. Not the military, not one of the gum-chewing boorish draftees with their greedy peasant faces wandering up Market Street, gaping at the bawdy shows, the sex movies, the shooting galleries, the cheap nightclubs, etc., etc. He says, no, this man was of the elite, cultured, educated, even more so than Mr. Tagomi, who, after all, was a high official with the ranking trade mission on the Pacific coast. Tagomi was an old man. His attitudes had formed in the war cabinet days. And this is going to be very important. These are younger people. They represent a different attitude, a different mindset. And so they talk a bit about, what sort of artifacts are available. The girl says, we're starting to decorate, a bit undecided. Do you think you could inform us? And Childan says, well, I could arrange to arrive at your apartment bringing several hand cases I can suggest in context at your leisure. And they go back and forth. And Childan eventually says, shall we make arrangements? And he takes down their name and address. And he examines his notes. And he thinks about, yes, these are younger people. He says, it was a chance to meet a young Japanese couple socially on a basis of acceptance of him as a man, rather than as a Yank, or at best a tradesman who sold art objects. These new young people of the rising generation who did not remember the days before the war or even the war itself, they were the hope of the world. place difference did not have the significance for them, it will end, Childan thought. Someday, the very idea of place, not governed and governing, but people. But yet he's trembling with fear as well. So this is a very interesting engagement, isn't it? And, they look at him with kindness, not superiority. There's the possibility of some sort of equality between them, despite the power differential, the race difference, all of that. And then they invite him to their home, and not just as a business proposal, but for dinner, a social engagement. This is very important. He says to himself, I'm not invited in a business context, but as a dinner guest. And there's going to be a lot of ambivalence on the part of Robert Childan in his engagement. But he's treated as an honored guest. Betty meets him there. Mr. Childan, enter. He enters, tasteful in the extreme and so ascetic. Few pieces, a lamp here, table, bookcase, print on the wall. And we'll talk about what this signifies in a bit. And then Mr. Kasoura says, a drink, scotch and soda. And he says, Mr. Kasoura. And then Mr. Kasoura says, Paul, the young Japanese man said, indicating his wife, Betty. And you are, Mr. Childan murmured, Robert. What are they doing there? They're establishing a certain kind of equality. They're engaging in exchange of first names, saying that our races don't matter so much. All the things that people pay attention to outside, that's not it. And they engage in a whole series of conversations, which again, some ambiguity involved in these. And coming back to the description, all of the description of their home, the incredible Japanese sense of wabi, it could not be thought in English, the ability to find in simple objects a beauty beyond that of the elaborate or the ornate, something to do with the arrangement. Now, this is Childan thinking to himself about this young couple. And then we go on a little bit further, and we see another description here. The wabi around him, radiations of harmony, that's it, he decided. The proportion, balance. They, meaning the Kasouras, are close to the Tao, these two young Japanese. That's why I reacted to them before. I sensed the Tao through them, saw a glimpse of it myself, and then he sort of muses, what would it be like to really know the Tao? The Tao is that which first lets the light, then the dark, occasions the interplay of the two primal forces. So there's always renewal. It is that which keeps it all from wearing down. The universe will never be extinguished because just when the darkness seems to have smothered it all, to be truly transcendent, the new seeds of light are reborn in the very depths. That is the way. And then his thoughts are broken by Betty saying, an hors d'oeuvre here. So this is really putting them up on kind of a pedestal, isn't it? Now, they discuss a lot of different topics. For example, the succession that's likely to happen within the Nazi Party and the Reich. And it's very interesting to see the differences between them. Paul says, international news much in notice these days, and they're talking about like who is under arrest and who isn't. And then Paul asks, what else is reported by the Nippon Times? And she says, much confusion and intriguing. Army units moving from hither to yon, leaves canceled, border stations closed, Reichstag in session, speeches by all. And then they talk about Goebbels. And Childan is saying, oh, he's such a great orator, a A1 Nazi speaker. And Paul and Betty say, yeah, that's quite true. And then they start talking about sexual depravity on the part of the Nazis. And, Childan says, I wouldn't give rumors the time of day. Paul says, well, I was thinking more of Goering. He seems to be engaging in orgies and stuff like that. And Childan says, lies. And then Betty keeps the peace by saying, the subject isn't worth discussing. And then Paul says something. Lots of hot blood stirred up in political discussion. Everywhere you go, essential to keep head. And he also says, maybe we should drop politics, right? They're going to come back to it, though. And then they begin to discuss some literature. Turns out that Paul himself, as he's going to tell us, is very interested in science fiction. He describes himself as an enthusiast. He began that hobby early in his life. He was merely 12 during the early years of the war, and they begin discussing this absolutely central book, The Grasshopper Lies Heavy, an alternate history book within this alternate history novel. And they get Childan's interest intrigued, in part because in it, the Allies win the war. But there's a worry about, what does it mean that the Russians were in the Allies? Did they win the war? And Robert is actually going to go on kind of a rant about how, the Japanese and the Germans winning the war, even though it subjugated America, was worth it precisely because it meant that the communist hordes could be kept at bay. He says, we had to suffer to pay the cost to stop Slavic world inundation. And then Betty says something really interesting. This is where she reveals her own mindset and probably that of Paul. She says, personally, I do not believe any hysterical talk of world inundation by any people, Slavic or Chinese or Japanese. She regarded Robert placidly. She was in complete control of herself, not carried away, but she intended to express her feeling. So this is quite revelatory. These people are rather free of the nationalistic mindset of others. They begin to discuss music, and Paul, as it turns out, is an enthusiast not just of science fiction, but of Negro music, which he says is the really authentic American music, right? And he brings up Bunk Johnson, Kid Ory, and the like, early Dixieland jazz. And Robert Childan says, no, I'm not interested in that stuff. I prefer classical, Bach and Beethoven. And he feels a bit of resentment towards Paul. Was he supposed to deny the great masters of European music in favor of New Orleans jazz from the honky-tonks and bistros of the Negro Quarter? And Paul actually says, maybe I'll play some of this for you. And Betty's like, nah, don't do that. So there's an interesting thing going on there. And they also talk briefly about the cuisine. What does Betty make? T-bone steak, baked potato with sour cream and chives, trying to make it as authentic an American experience as possible. And Childan really appreciates that because he doesn't have steak very often. And he's like, oh, thank God I don't have to have Japanese food like I do pretty much all the time. So there's some interesting stuff going on there. What else is happening in all these engagements? We see Childan doing two things. One is, at several different points, he expresses himself in a way that is disharmonious. And he's like, oh man, I'm blowing it here. And there's several different places where he's like, these Japanese, they're so cultured. I really am kind of a barbarian in relation to them. But then, and this is a sign of Childan's own character, he also, on his own, is sort of putting them down in his own head. And he says, I'm trying to pretend that these Japanese people and I are alike. Observe, even when I burst out as to my gratification they won the war that my nation lost, there's still no common ground. We're not equal. We're not even really doing the same thing. He goes on and says, what words mean to me is in sharp contrast vis-a-vis them. Their brains are different, their souls likewise. Witness them drinking from English bone china cups, eating with U.S. silver, listening to Negro style of music. It's all on the surface. Wealth and power makes this available to them, but it's ersatz as the day is long. What does ersatz substitute? Fake, right? He says, even the I Ching, they took that from the Chinese. And then he thinks to himself, you cook the native foods to perfection. What they say is true. Your powers of imitation are immense. Apple pie, Coca-Cola, stroll after the movie, Glenn Miller. You could paste together out of tin and rice paper a complete artificial America. Rice paper mom in the kitchen, rice paper dad reading the newspaper, rice paper pup at his feet. Paul was watching him silently. Robert Childan, suddenly noticing the man's attention, seized his line of thought and applied himself to his food. Can he read my mind? He wondered. And can he see what I'm really thinking? I know I didn't show it. I kept the proper expression. So Childan is kind of a conflicted character, isn't he? And there's really nothing to suggest that the Kasouras themselves fit the model of what it is that Childan is thinking about them and the Japanese in general. If anything, they seem to be exceptions to this, the sign of a new direction for perhaps the elite, perhaps the youth. And the scene, which is quite long, ends with Robert, leaving and thinking to himself, I always wondered what it would be like to meet certain customers socially. Not so bad after all. This may help me in my business. It's therapeutic to meet these people who have intimidated you and to discover what they're really like. Then the intimidation goes. And we can ask ourselves, did he really learn what they were really like or not? That's a great question here. Finally, we come to an engagement which is not involving Betty, but just Robert Childan and Paul Kasoura. It does involve Betty in a way, because Robert attempted a sort of seduction, sending by way of Paul a piece of jewelry from Ed Frank Jewelry, which represents the new, the American, right? Which is supposed to be destined for Betty. And he and Paul meet up, and Paul tells him, I didn't actually send the piece of jewelry to her. It's not left this office. And Paul says, what I did do this is show it to a number of business associates, individuals who share my taste for American historic objects or artifacts of general artistic, aesthetic merit. None, of course, had ever seen such as this before. As you explained, no such contemporary work has been known. And I think, too, you informed that you are the sole representative. And what did these people do? They laughed at it. And I, too, Paul says, laughed behind my hand, invisible to you. The other day when you appeared and showed me this thing, naturally to protect your sang-froid, I concealed that amusement. As you don't no doubt recall, I remained more or less non-committal in my apparent reaction. So he's revealing himself to Robert, which shows a certain kind of integrity on his part. And then he says, I actually realized something. This piece of jewelry has woo, not wabi. It doesn't have aesthetic value in itself. It's got something almost like a religious value, except it's different than religious artifacts because this is a work of art. This is something radically new, he is going to say. Here's how he discusses it. In other words, an entire new world is pointed to. By this, the name for it is neither art, for it has no form, nor religion. What is it? I have pondered this pin unceasingly, yet cannot fathom it. It is authentically a new thing on the face of the world. What does this show us about Paul? He's willing to share this information with Robert, and he is able to grasp and appreciate this. So Paul himself is, quite an extraordinary person. And then he tells, Robert that I have tried to impress my viewpoint on my colleagues. One of them has an extraordinary business opportunity for you. We can take this jewelry, if you've got some of it, and we can mass produce it as charms, which could be sold throughout South America. Poor people would love this sort of thing. You could become very, very wealthy, Robert. And what he's doing here is he's posing Robert with a crisis, with a challenge. And at first, Childan goes along with it, and Paul has said, don't underevaluate the possibility suggested by the esteemed importer. He's a shrewd personage. This could make you incredibly wealthy. And Childan says, I'll follow your advice. I'll leave to visit the importer. And then Paul doesn't seem happy with this, and he asks Robert, will the artists go along with this? And Childan says, yes, I think they will. Then, something in his tone made Robert Childan take sudden note. A nebulous, peculiar emphasis there. And it swept over Childan. Without a doubt, he'd split the ambiguity. He saw the whole affair, a cruel dismissal of American efforts taking place before his eyes. Cynicism, but God forbid he'd swallowed hook, line, and sinker. Got me to agree, step by step. Led me along the garden path to this conclusion. Products of American hands, no good for nothing but to be models for junky good luck charms. And he says, Christ, we are barbarians compared to them. We're no more than boobs against such pitiless reasoning. Paul did not tell me our art was worthless. He got me to say it for him. And he decides, I'm going to do something different here. He says to Paul, I am humiliated. And Paul says, why so, Robert? Now notice, tones of concern but detached, above involvement. Paul, one moment. I am proud of this work. There can be no consideration of trashy good luck charms. I reject. And then he says, thank you, however. And Paul bows, and Robert Childan bowed. And then he says, the men who made this are American proud artists, myself included. To suggest trashy good luck charms therefore insults us, and I ask for apology. Paul surveyed him. One eyebrow lifted slightly, and his thin lips twitched a smile. I demand, Childan said. That was all. He could carry it no further. He now merely waited. Nothing occurred. Please, he thought, help me. And then Paul says, this goes back to this issue of equality and graciousness. Paul said, forgive my arrogant imposition. He held out his hand. All right, Robert Childan said. They shook hands. And what's going on here? Is it complete equality? No, not exactly, but it's a creation of equality. And this can happen precisely, not just because of Robert Childan's sudden moment of courage and decision, but because Paul is the sort of person who not only engineered this situation, but can respond appropriately. We go back to closeness to the Tao and the proper response. So we have some very, very interesting characters in this husband-wife team of young Japanese people, cultured elite, engaging primarily with Robert Childan, but presumably with the greater world around them. And that's all that we get to know about these two people in Man in the High Castle. But it's something, I would say, quite attractive, quite appealing, quite admirable that we have revealed to us.